Good evening. A warm welcome and a Happy New Year to those attending and also to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is a meeting of the Children, Families and Education Select Committee. My name is Councillor Heena Makwana and I'm the chair of this committee. Details of the business to be considered today is shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and also accessible on YouTube underneath the broadcast. We are not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. For those in the room, please switch any mobile devices to silent before the meeting starts, and when you are invited to speak, please ensure that you turn your microphones on so that you can be heard in the recording. For those watching via YouTube, if you are so minded, you can complete one of our resident feedback forms. These can be found in the information section underneath the YouTube video. These forms are intended to help us improve the way that we run our meetings. Okay. Before we go through our agenda, I'd like to introduce colleagues in the room. So to my right, I have Councillors Batt, Smallwood and Hagger. To my left, Dem Services Officer Ryan Dell, and then Councillor Sweeting, Core, Gill and our co-opted member, Mr Little. Officers presenting this evening, Michael Hawkins, Dan Kennedy, Abby Preston, Catherine Angelini and perhaps Julie Kelly might come a bit later, maybe? We're not sure. No. Okay. Thank you for that. Right. Okay. So let's move on to agenda item 1. Apologies for absence. Ryan, please.
We have apologies from Councillor Gagg with Councillor Core substituting.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Councillor Core, for subbing. Item 2, declarations of interest in matters coming before this meeting. Are there any? No? Great, thank you. Item 3, minutes of the previous meeting, the 15th of November. Again, another comprehensive set of minutes, so thank you very much, Ryan, for all the hard work that you put into them. Can we agree the minutes? Perfect, thank you. Item 4 is to confirm that the items of business marked in Part 1 will be considered in public, and the items marked as Part 2 will be considered in private. There are no Part 2 items. So straight on to agenda item 5, which is the Ukrainian children update. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Michael and I will do a double act in terms of providing an update to the committee. So this is a scheduled update to the committee on the education support for refugees from Ukraine. That's the second update that we've provided. So just really just to set out at the beginning that we have been supporting arrivals from Ukraine, those who've been displaced by the conflict since March 22. And we've been working with a whole range of different organisations to do that, including schools, of course. And we have a number of residents, hosts in the borough, which are providing homes really to those who've been displaced. And we continue to work with a whole range of different organisations who are providing outreach and support to those families to ensure that they settle really into our communities. So in terms of the report, we've got within the report on pages 22 onwards some of the support arrangements which are provided. I'll ask Michael just to expand in a moment on some of those. But if I just give a sort of a very broad brush update. So St Mary's provision is one particular that we'd like to draw some attention to, and Michael will expand on that in a moment, including the Ukraine education team here within the local authority. But in addition to those, we've got an educational psychology offer. So we've commissioned 32 days of support to working with Ukrainian children, which includes support for health pathways for those who've understandably been identified with trauma, and individual schools as well who need some support in supporting those children, and importantly assessing children with suspected undiagnosed special education needs at different ages as well, because sometimes the language barrier or speech barriers can be apparent. A school support offer as well. So Michael's education improvement team provides support to schools, and I've been working with them for quite some time in terms of advice, guidance and training, and so we've been updating information that's available to schools, and also importantly where English is an additional language, ensuring that support's available. Post-16 support as well through young people aged 16 to 19 has been particularly important, and we've provided again support access to those services, information in different languages including Ukrainian as well. Hub schools, we've got 2 hub schools in the borough which we're working closely with to provide additional support, and just recently approved as well, and it's a 2-year service offer. Is an additional language and support and speech service available to schools, all schools in the borough, at no charge to schools for 2 years. So that's something that's about to go live very, very shortly. If I could ask Michael just to expand a little bit more in terms of the St Mary's provision and the direct support that we're providing for our own school improvement team as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. I'll just say a few words about some of the provisions and then invite any questions if that's okay. So, as it says, the range of support that we've put together is a reflection too of the conversations we've had with some of our schools, particularly those in the south of the borough, about some of the needs. They weren't just talking about Ukrainian refugees, but just in general. And what we've attempted to do is to put together a range of support packages that can help them to deliver on their sort of day-to-day needs. A councillor told us about St Mary's Ukrainian School, which is a Ukrainian school set up when the war started by Ukrainian refugees, and they've been working with a number of boroughs in London and outside of London, ostensibly to have a supplementary school, but they've also received sort of funding to train their own workers to work directly with schools. So we kind of did a reciprocal arrangement with part of the funding that we sponsored them to host a supplementary school in Hillingdon, so that any Ukrainian family would have a focal point to go to, not just those from the Homes for Ukraine programme. And they provided us with 5 trained what we're calling education support workers. They've been trained in things that you wouldn't normally expect people to be trained in. They've been working with the North West Health Trust before they came to us in things like early trauma identification, on-site support, and then of course those health pathways. So we also employed 3 people ourselves on fixed-term contracts with the funding. The programme manager is a lawyer. She's a refugee parent that's a resident in Hillingdon. Another member of staff is also a refugee parent resident in Hillingdon. They've all been through the same experience, and so we're lucky because we've got 8 people for a very efficient use of the funding, and they've been working directly with our schools. They mainly all started September, October time, and I suppose the biggest thing to think about is we actually set up a Homes for Ukraine team very early on when we got the funding, and they were covering everything from identifying who the families were, because it wasn't that easy to pick up, and issues that were coming forward around housing. We reached out to schools, and schools didn't really reach back out to the team. They weren't really flagging up with any issues, so things like attendance or trauma, suspicions, or even undiagnosed needs. But as soon as the Ukrainians started reaching out to schools and the families, then we got lots more information. So the team have already been quite effective in 3 months in supporting families directly with a range of things from trauma support, facilitating access to pathways for PTSD, those kind of things. So what's interesting was, like quite a few refugee communities, they didn't feel they could tell the schools. That sort of education and what was going on for them is separate. So that's I think that's been a positive success. And the good thing is, you may be aware that some of the families from Ukraine are actually Afghani, and so we've got a group of Afghani refugee families from the Ukraine displaced twice, and the programme manager and a number of others, they actually actively work with Afghani support groups across West London. So that's kind of a difficult nationality to identify in terms of recruiting people. We've tried and not been so successful. So it's all sort of coming together. The education psychology offer is a reflection of something that the schools identify, because it's a buyback service in Hillingdon, and schools do buy into it, but undiagnosed special needs amongst the group is one of the things, as is a speedy referral pathway, I believe, to where people are showing the signs of PTSD and things like that. So that's really some of the elements of what we've got. What we've assured as well is that 0 to 5, we've given some money to children's centres because we know that Ukrainian families have been accessing children's centres, support for primary, secondary, yes, but also we've been providing support post-16, well, 14 to 19. So we're just launching a mentoring programme for Ukrainian refugees that might be at risk of need or might be trying to navigate their pathways. Our workers have managed to place children in, well, we've got 80 refugees in Harrow, Richmond and Uxbridge College in the Uxbridge Centre or the Hayes campus, and so we're supporting them with information events and other things as well. But also we've placed students in Burley College and West Thames College, which is actually in Hounslow, but they offered an additional support package with a big EAL focus but a broad curriculum offer for anybody that might be in Year 11 and post-16. So that was also fully funded by the government if they were placed there before October the 31st. So just ensuring that everybody's on a sensible educational pathway, really. I don't know if anybody's got any questions about anything.
Okay, all right. Councillor Hagar.
Yes, thank you. Really good to have an update, and it's really good to see that this is something new, and actually we've come really well together, putting everything in place and covered quite a wide range here. So I'm brilliant. I'm interested in the St Mary's provision. Definitely for me, looking at that, it's ticking all the boxes. It's bringing the whole person together, looking at the issues, and obviously seeing the impact. What we have here is the school was launched in September 2023, currently 38 Hillingdon young people. But there's an expectation that obviously we could have more I can see why, because it's a good provision. One, what's our maximum, how many people could or how many children could we hold in there? And when we look like we might be having more, what does that look like? Are we talking about months? Are we talking about years? Is there any, I mean, you might not have any indication, but do you have any answers? Thank you.
I don't have any answers, but there are some basic statistics in there, so you can see that just the Homes for Ukraine under 18 group, which was the sponsored group for the funding, we've had in total 118. We currently have 64. There's a lot of mobility. There's also a great desire for people to go back to their countries, because basically it's mainly females here with their children, and all the men are in Ukraine. So, but since our own team started with the St Mary's working together, they meet weekly here. They've identified 148 Ukrainian children in our schools. They're not all Homes for Ukraine, but some of them came under the Friends and Family scheme, and it's very fluid. So there are people still coming in, and there are people leaving it. So it's fairly mobile, which presents some challenges to schools, of course, just like it does with some of our other groups. So the all we can say is we know that there's still movement and things like that. In terms of the capacity of the supplementary school, Oakwood agreed to host them. Oakwood's got very good facilities. They're very happy with the school being hosted there at the weekend, and the school's very happy to be there. So in terms of capacity, they're fairly fluid about it. They said to me originally 70, and I said, well, we gave you quite a lot of money, so maybe we'll just see how it goes. But we've now marketed it in every school. There's posters up in Ukrainian with a sort of a QR code that somebody can put their camera to. So what we're trying to ensure is that every Ukrainian family knows that there's support available through a multitude of ways. They're also translating a number of sort of key education documents for us, like our post-16 prospectus, so that, you know, moving forwards we'll have a number of core documents in Ukrainian. They didn't want them translated into Russian. Well, it's interesting because actually, you know, historically there's some of them are first language Russian, but actually they were adamant that they didn't want that to happen, whereas in some boroughs they've done it in Russian and Ukrainian. But we said, okay, if that's what you want, you know better than we do.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sweeting. Just one moment.
I'm very interested about St Mary's because when I saw St Nicholas in the Civic Centre on the 7th of December, I saw the head teacher of St Mary's, and she was a governor of a local school, and so we picked up from there. They're using 7 classes and the hall in Oakwood, but if Oakwood's full capacity, if you like, comes through, because we know that we've got tightness, are they still going to have the 7 classes? I know it's weekends, but obviously those classes are adapted in some way and can't be, quickly brought back into class basis. So what's the long-term future for St Mary's? And is there any sort of other location that will have a similar, could possibly be used as well? Because we've got quite a few of our primaries that have got unfilled class bases.
I mean, when we made the arrangement with them and provided them with some funding, initially it was on a 1-year basis, so the time is ticking. Their plan was to charge families, but I was kind of keen that they didn't charge families, particularly because we had the funding. Different local authorities have offered them different models. I think we've been quite generous with them, but it's probably in our best interest to have that base. I suppose none of us know what's going to happen, both in terms of funding and support, but there will be a conversation that we need to have about that coming into the summer term, I believe, and that's. I think the value of it is probably quite clear, but nobody actually knows about the continuation of funding and support at the moment.
Okay, can I go round and I'll come back to you again? Councillor Smallwood, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I think at any time when we talk about the Ukraine, it's important to reaffirm our support for the Ukraine as they wage an illegal war, acted by a tyrant, basically. But, and it's important to recognise that. I think my interest is actually people that are going back to the Ukraine, especially young people, and how we send them back, or how and whether we do have any communication with the education setting that they may be going back to, and what we do to support them as they return, which may be even more complicated than actually when they arrive, when we're almost responsible for their education.
In terms of the support available, I mean, we use the LEAP portal for our kind of resources and communication with schools, and from the very outset we'd already populated it with. There are actually, at the time, of virtual Ukrainian schools. Some children have continued their education in Ukrainian directly with schools in the Ukraine, so there's a lot of a fluid model taking place. Families seem to make their own choices about going back, and they're going back to places where, of course, things are functioning. And where, I suppose the key thing is that they know that there's any support that they might need, they can come to us and talk to us about it. So that's been the biggest thing, making sure that they know there's somebody that they can talk to that understands. So, but what's interesting is they haven't necessarily been removed from their own education in the Ukraine because of online learning. Ukrainian schools online doing the full curriculum. Some of them are doing that alongside going to school.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Little.
Thank you. I just mentioned that I'm a governor of Hillingdon, since that's mentioned in the report. And I wanted to follow up on the last part and then extend that, if I may, that do we provide any facilities for them to keep up with the sorts of qualifications they might need back in the Ukraine at those earlier levels in the school, firstly, and then the second is there any provision for their spiritual needs? Because I guess most of them in those terms would be Orthodox, and there isn't much in the way of Orthodox facilities within the borough, is there?
It's a good point. I don't know about their spiritual needs and whether they go further afield. I can tell you that our programme manager and our parent that works for us both are very active in the church in West London, and they're Orthodox themselves. In fact, that's where they bumped into a few of our councillors. So I don't know the answer to that one. In terms of qualifications, one of the things that parents have fed back to us, including at that event that Councillor Sweeting attended, was that their eyes have been opened in some respects to some of the rationales about how some of our pupils in this country do the learning, how developing questioning. So I think they're quite happy with the qualifications that their children are working towards. They've said to us that actually things like creative subjects aren't really valued that much in the Ukrainian education system. It's very much, science, technology, mathematics, and things like that. So that's been an eye-opener for them, and we've had some really kind of positive feedback about that, just for the experience they're getting. In terms of qualification pathways, if and when people go back, we aren't doing anything to match it to the Ukrainian one. We're just allowing them to pursue those levels as they want. So we have helped a couple of students get into university. They were 17 years old, and so we gave them access to careers advice and guidance that allowed them to understand how they could apply for that. So I think that's probably the most we've done.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kaur.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to understand a couple of things. One, it says that voluntary sector partners and council maintain regular contact with those who have settled in Hillingdon. So what does regular in this context mean? So do you have a time frame for that? And if I may, then you can would like to answer together. Some of the children have, 12 children are attending out of borough schools. I wanted to understand if they could not be accommodated, or was it by their choice? Thank you.
In terms of providing support and maintaining contact with families, we work with or have commissioned an organisation called Trinity, which is a local organisation in the borough. And it very much is a case-by-case basis. So certainly new arrivals or those who need to make connections and might need extra support, the sort of frequency and level of contact is tailored to their needs. Many actually, once they settle or make some connections, they're quite happy just to kind of move on with their lives and make friends and relationships with others in the community and inside and outside the borough. So there probably isn't a hard and fast rule, is the honest answer to that question, but it's something we're continuing to commission Trinity to provide that level of support. That's what's important, that they know they have someone to go to if they need to. In terms of, I suppose, school admissions and placement, we would need to look into that, but to my knowledge there isn't any particular pressures that I'm aware of in the borough that would mean we couldn't accommodate or make a school place offer inside the borough. It really depends on where they're hosting and where they may have moved on. Most likely they would have moved on because they would have been hosted originally in the borough. Possibly it might have been that some of them were hosted close to the borough boundary, and selected by choice a school outside the borough. But there are no pressures that I'm aware of with finding school places in borough.
Councillor Sweeting.
Thank you. There were not two tranches of money that came from central government. I was wondering whether all of the funding has actually been spent, and is there any indication that there may be more, because there are more and more Ukrainian families coming that are not part of the first wave that was supported by central government funding. So, basically, has all the funding been spent, and will there be any more coming? The allocation of funding depends upon the visa scheme that the families arrive. So Homes for Ukraine, there is funding attached. The government have just confirmed that funding for hosts, monthly payments to hosts, will continue. That sort of importantly does sort of settle down and stabilise the housing situation, because that's the one thing. And it also means that, many have now obviously been living with their hosts for 18 months, 24 months now, and so they've actually become quite settled and in a supportive environment. So that's obviously important, particularly
for not disrupting any schools that children attend, so that's important. In terms of sort of additional or future funding, we would need to just see really. I mean, we've obviously had the education grant, and we would need to wait for any further announcements on funding. But as Michael said, some of these schemes, whilst we have and continue to support families, we would want to continue, and would obviously, my experience today is that government have been supportive in continuing funding for those that have been displaced by the conflict.
I was wondering how the moving out for accommodation is working, because obviously we all know about the tightness of accommodation with residents that have lived in Hillingdon for many, many years. So how is that working in practice, please?
So particularly through working with Trinity, who have roots in supporting families who find themselves homeless, or individuals who find themselves homeless, they've got very good knowledge about how the housing market works and the processes around, particularly around homelessness. But importantly, we would be wanting to work proactively with hosts to avoid a sort of homeless crisis really for any individual family, and any move is undertaken in a planned way. Now obviously that isn't always the case and things go wrong unexpectedly. So if that situation were to arise, we would provide support to families to access typically private rented accommodation. If there is a particular need in the household, then there may need to be other housing or accommodation options considered. But the important message is that we avoid a homeless crisis for the household, and we work with the family to access financial support from the local authority to secure accommodation in the private rented sector, typically a 2-year tenancy.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Kaur?
Thank you, Chair. I also read that you said that there was funding available that schools have not used or utilised. I was wondering, why do you think that could be the case? And now with 8 members of the team, say 5 external and 3 in-house, do you think it's likely to change, so like schools are more aware of what Ukrainian children need? And I think initially you also mentioned that this kind of model has worked well with Ukrainians, and do you think it could be offered to other refugee children and asylum seekers as well, because of the way it has worked out so well for them? Thank you.
I'm going to start with the last question. So, I mean, in terms of models of support, the other refugee groups are Sudanese and Afghanis who are supported with funding. We are working closely with Trinity to deliver a very similar model of support. The level of funding, grant funding, though, doesn't extend into all the areas that those who've come from Ukraine have experienced. So, particularly the education grant, that doesn't exist in other respects. However, levels of funding per family are very similar, and so we can use the funding that's allocated per family for targeted or particular support, housing accommodation costs, or particular support, education support needs that may come up. Do you want to pick up the other?
Yeah, I mean, if we work backwards, yeah, that was the first one, wasn't it? Well, again, you know, it's one of those little conundrums, isn't it? I mean, generally with these things, there needs to be some sort of point of awareness raising where people take an interest. So because the schools didn't flag up the Ukrainians children as presenting them with any problems, they weren't that aware, and because families weren't really going to the schools for help, they think school is for school to sit there and learn, which is fair enough. That doesn't necessarily come out. We knew that there would be more coming out, and so we let them know about the funding about January last year. So, but then only 7 schools attended it was an online sort of session to talk about these things for those that had refugees, asylum seekers, including those from Ukraine. It wasn't just to talk about Ukrainian children. And there are many more schools that could have attended. Many of them are in the south of the borough, as we know. And it's kind of interesting. I think, so we keep looking at how the money is used to give the most effective support. So the issue around the thing with the provision around Language Link, which is a speech, language and communication assessment tool, but also provides toolkits and has EAL strands, is by giving a licence to all schools. Some schools are very familiar with using it and paying for a licence themselves, but not all of them. That can support any child, refugee, asylum seeker, those with delayed speech, language and communication, including native speakers. So, but it supports Ukrainians absolutely, but it also supports any newly arrived child as those in developing stages of sort of language development. And when you look at the detail of it, it's exactly the kind of tool and information that teachers would need to be able to understand what they need to incorporate into their teaching to make some of that language development explicit. So that's one use of some of the funding that should benefit everybody.
Thank you. So if you have this funding which has not been utilized, is it ring-fenced, or do you think you would be able to use it somewhere else and then provide support to others who need it?
I mean, it will be ring-fenced to the extent that it will be available for children from Ukraine. Yeah. And I think that's probably the extent of the ring-fence. However, we do work closely with schools, encouraging them to put in place the arrangements necessary to support those children and families, and I guess trying to use it in creative ways to ensure that it does deliver the support needed.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Great. Okay, we bring this item to a close. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Are you staying, or you're staying? Okay. Thank you, Michael. Okay, agenda item 6, school admissions arrangements. Is it you, Abby? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a report to gather comments on the PAN reduction for Whitehall Infant School and Whitehall Junior School. So the recommendation is that we reduce PAN from 120 to 90 in both schools. I'm sure you're aware, but classes really need to have children of around 25 in a class in order to be financially viable. And we are constantly reviewing our PAN and admissions arrangements for our schools in light of the sort of changing numbers over time, to make sure that our schools can manage financially whilst also meeting the local demand for children in the area. So the School Admissions Code does determine that we must consult on all changes for a minimum of 6 weeks, and we undertook that consultation between 23rd of October and 18th of December with no responses received. So I think all the key information is within the report, so I'll open it for comment at this point.
Okay, Councillor Sweeting.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at page 36, where you've got the primary planning area 6 and the audit of schools within that planning area. The census, though, is for last year. I mean, it would have been useful, I think, to have had the current year's numbers, because that will give us a better indication of exactly what the situation is now. But I'm just looking at the other schools. You've got 5 schools in that area where you look at the PAN and you look at the reception numbers, and there's only 7 spaces between those 5 schools. Now, wriggle room is not a great, it's not 7 spaces between 5 schools is not good. And if you look at the reception for Whitehall, I know that's a year out of date now, it's 14 above their proposed new PAN. Now, if it was back to 90, there literally would not be any spare spaces in that group. So my concern is looking at the projections, and it would have been useful to have had current numbers rather than last year's numbers. Looking at the projections, are the projections for planning area 6 showing a decrease in numbers? Because only then will it be possible to fit capacity to numbers coming through.
Thank you, Councillor Sweeting. The confirmed numbers for entry are on the final column for September 2023. So you can see for the infant school it's 93 and for the junior school it's 87. So that has dropped significantly from the previous years. So I believe that they are projected to decrease again, and that is an area that we're watching to make sure that the PANs are in line with demand. But I'll double check that just to make sure. But I'm fairly confident that that's a result of the projected decrease in roles.
Okay. Just go to Councillor Smallwood and then I'll come to you again.
Sorry, Chair, I've now become a little bit confused, which is fairly regular, but particularly confused now. So my understanding is the numbers for this year are shown in the final column. Just to be clear, those are the numbers for this year. So those are a significant decrease, which, unless I've been living on another planet, which is another possibility, we are seeing a fairly significant decrease in primary numbers across the borough in all planning areas, which is obviously something that is a pan-London problem, even more focused in central London, and therefore that is why decisions like these are having to be made. I've not imagined that at any point, have I?
No, absolutely.
Sorry.
And that's why we monitor really closely the movement in pupil numbers, across our primary schools, because we know that our primaries overall are decreasing year on year and our secondaries are higher numbers at the moment that we're managing through the system. So that's why it's really important that we're responsive to the changes, because it will leave our schools in a financially really challenging position. So, for example, Whitehall Infant School having 93, that's a really challenging number because that's 3 over your classes. And with an infant school, you're limited on class sizes, whereas in the junior school, you have a little bit more flexibility. So it would have caused significant financial challenge for that school to manage 3 over. So that's why we are monitoring really closely these numbers over time, and we are creating a school organisation plan that will have more detailed projections that will show the sort of plan over time, because this is a really important, crucial time for us to make sure that we're supporting our primaries and being responsive to those changes. The positive thing is that our schools have the capacity, where they've reduced plan, to obviously increase plan. So they have that estate and we have that flexibility within the system. So should there be any pressure, we can easily expand numbers and be responsive to that. But so far, our data is showing us that we need to reduce these roles to ensure that the schools are financially viable.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing that you just mentioned, Abby, that we can, if need be, make the space again. So we've got that. Okay, Councillor Sweeting.
Well, my subsequent question is about those 7 empty classrooms between the 2 schools. In the past, we have actually used empty classrooms in at least 2 schools for SEND children, one being Ruislip and the other being Pinkwell. And I was just wondering, because this is not the only set of schools where we've got this, I won't say a problem, but this issue, whether there's been any thought about the utilisation of classrooms for other things, maybe only on a temporary basis, which is like Oakwood using their 7 classrooms, because we've got the word hubs coming up, hubs all over the place, and I don't know whether accommodation in our primaries can be utilised for to support the council in various initiatives, because this is what's happened in the past, and because there's now a pattern happening, whether this could be looked at as a sort of policy, that we look at schools where it's likely that their PAN is going to be reduced, to see whether there's some joined up thinking here, and whether that's happened already for the Whitehall schools.
Thank you, Councillor Sweeting. And a good point, I think. The challenge we have is a number of our schools have vacant space in primary sector, and in order to create SEND provision, there's minimum space that we need according to BB 104 regulations, and it's also challenging to set up a SEND provision that might be temporary and then removing that. So we have to think really carefully about the decisions that we make. But we are always working with our schools to try and find ways to help them attract more income, potentially, where they might have available space, and look at creative ways, such as the St Mary's provision, to support. The challenge is, at the moment, and presumably it will be a temporary phase, we do have a number of schools without additional space, so we need to look really carefully and make sure that the planning area has enough sort of foundations in place to be able to grow that provision as and when needed and be responsive to changes. But it is important that we work with our schools and look at creative ways to support them with that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? No? Councillor Kaur?
Just out of curiosity, Abby, because PAN numbers go down and then primaries are shrinking, I'm just for my information, what happens to the redundancies in teacher vacancies, like teachers becoming redundant, and so is Hillingdon going to use them somewhere, or it's entirely up to them to go look for jobs, or what's happening?
Councillor Kaur, is that question related to this agenda item? Because we're talking about school admissions arrangements. I'm not really sure how exactly that question links. Teacher recruitment and retention.
No, basically, because if the numbers go down, the requirement of teachers and resources will go down, isn't it?
Yeah, but we're talking specifically about admissions arrangements. I mean, Abby, if you've got a response, but otherwise I don't think that's relevant at this.
That's okay, thank you.
I'll respond sort of briefly on that note around falling pupil roles and managing staffing numbers. We would support schools to look to gradually reduce over time rather than doing sort of big redundancy restructures. And most of our leaders, you know, they're very responsive to these sorts of things, and as pupil numbers drop, they don't recruit as a teacher leaves, and they do it through natural changes rather than doing redundancies where possible.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? No? Great. Okay, let's bring this agenda item to close. Abby, are you staying? Oh, Dan's leaving. Thank you, Dan. Agenda item 7, DPS for alternative provision. Catherine.
Thank you, Chair. So this is an update on the dynamic purchasing system. It is on, yes. That's all right. So it's okay. It's an update on the dynamic purchasing system for alternative provision that was presented to Cabinet in December for approval. This is a system that we're currently looking to launch in Hillingdon by April of this year, which is essentially going to be an alternative provision directory, which allows officers from various different services within the local authority to commission alternative provision for our children, depending on their needs. So those needs can vary. Sometimes children need an alternative provision for if they've been permanently excluded. Sometimes it's because they have a special educational need or disability. It could be because they're mentally or physically unfit to attend school for a medical reason. There are lots of different things. We need a broad range of alternative provision in order to meet those needs. Previously, the arrangements for commissioning alternative provision were quite individualised. Officers could make individual decisions on packages of support for our children and young people. What the dynamic purchasing system will do will streamline that and enable us to keep greater quality assurance, to greater safeguard our children, to hold providers to greater account for what the outcomes are, for reintegrating children back into their mainstream setting if it's appropriate, for thinking about their post-16 or post-18 pathways if that's relevant to them, and just generally making the whole process a lot more cohesive and easier to manage. So all the information really is in the paper. Any questions about what we're hoping to launch at the moment?
Thank you, Catherine. Councillor Smallwood.
Chair, thank you. So as to avoid not to incur your wrath for going off topic, I have lots of questions on alternative provision, but I don't necessarily have lots of questions on the dynamic purchasing system. So I wondered whether it would be possible to add to our work programme an officer information session where we could talk about alternative provision in Hillingdon. Otherwise, I note the paper as it's been through Cabinet, and I wondered if that was a way forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Smallwood. I agree. I think that's a good idea. I too have questions about alternative provision, so I think it'd actually be really beneficial to add it to our work programme if we all agree with that. Great, thank you. Councillor Sweeting.
I have concerns about the comments coming from the consultation. I mean, there was a lot of negative comments, which is concerning, and I really want to know whether the new system will in fact deliver better outcomes, because one of the requirements is good academic attainment on par with mainstream schools. well, we don't seem to have been delivering that, or maybe we have, but the comments coming from the users and maybe the users' parents are not suggesting that that's, you know, the way forward. So will this system be a better system, and how do we know it will be a better system, i.e. how are we going to be monitoring the development of this system? Because it seems to me that the old system did have input from officers, and that may well not be possible with the new system, which is concerning. So really the question is, a roundabout way is, how do we know that this system is going to be better?
So thank you, Councillor Sweeting. It might be easy if I just explain a little bit about how the system exactly will work, and then that might help to reassure you as to how we'll monitor and to hold these alternative provision providers to greater account. So essentially, officers will still have input. That's very much still part of the process. What they will do is complete a referral form or a profile for a young person based on their needs and what we're looking for. We'll be able to be more specific about the targets that we're looking for that young person, the aims of that alternative provision. So really thinking about alternative provision as an intervention as opposed to a destination where they're going to remain for a very long time. And then that profile will go out to the lots that are included in the DPS. So we have 4 lots depending on what the child might need. So it could be full-time education, part-time, it might be a bespoke provision that's more pastoral, or it could be post-16. Providers will be within the lots that they think they can offer to our young people. So the profile will go out to everybody, for example, in lot 1. They will come back with an offer if they feel they can meet the needs of the child that's in the profile, and then officers can make a decision on what's best for that young person based on the offers that come in. So it's not only about value for money, which we will be getting better value for hopefully, but it's also about seeing what's out there on the market. So it creates more, it takes away from that concept of just going to one provider and assuming they're going to be able to provide the best package. We're going to get options hopefully for our children and young people, which I think will create a better system. Does that answer the question?
Monitoring is going to be so important, isn't it, to make certain that what we want to achieve is being achieved. Because I know from experience that some of the education that some of our children not in school has been piecemeal, for, you know, to say the very least.
Yes, so in terms of monitoring outcomes and what happens for the children and young people, previously, as I said, lots of different services could commission individual packages, and there wasn't one particular service that had oversight for the management of that. Bringing this into my service, we now have the Vulnerable Learner Support Manager who is taking responsibility for that, is leading on the piece of work in relation to the DPS, and will be monitoring all of the outcomes. We've implemented a tracking system already, so we've already started to build that even before the DPS launches in April, so we're putting those in place, ready for its launch.
Okay, thank you. Mr Little. Oh, sorry, Abby.
Can I just add to that as well? Remembering back to the SEND strategy that we looked at in the last meeting, this is one of our key ambitions. So as part of that governance framework, we also have a sort of AP group that will have sort of strategic oversight of progress and development as well. So I think we're going to have really strong governance around this, and I think we'll see really positive outcomes.
Ms Little.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions, if I may. The first one is, what sort of confidence do you have that there will be the range of providers that you need? And the second one is, where you have needs for children that require the services of more than one provider to get them a full-time education, and the safeguarding issues that arise from that. I wonder if you could comment.
Thank you. So in terms of the range of provider, we have, I think you'll have seen in the Cabinet paper, we've already done 2 stakeholder events where we've gone out to the market and invited providers to come in. Those were both very well attended, and we were confident that just with the interest in those alone, we would have a good range. We had providers that we already work with, but new people that we'd never met before have shown an interest. The tendering process actually opened on Friday, just gone, and we've already had questions coming through. People are inquiring, so I am quite confident we're going to get the range that we're looking for. If we don't, the other benefit of having the DPS is that we can then go to providers and say, we have a need here in Hillingdon that isn't being met. We have a cohort here of children where we've consistently come to you. You haven't been able to meet it. Would somebody like to create an offer? So that's also the benefit of having the system. And just remind me of your second question.
It was in relation to if you need to use more than one provider to cope with what the child's needs are, whether the system will cope with having more than one supplier for an individual child, and if so, how is the safeguarding provided for?
Typically, we wouldn't expect any young person to actually need two alternative provision providers at any one time. What can happen is that a young person will be on the role of an alternative provision, and then they may need supplementary support in order to meet that child's needs, but ultimately the safeguarding responsibility would be for whoever is commissioning the alternative provision. So you can't have a child that's enrolled in two specific schools. They can only be on the role of one.
Can I ask for a little elaboration then? You said that the responsibility would be with the commissioner of it. So effectively somebody here in the Civic Centre would be doing that commission, and they would have responsibility for the safeguarding and so on that arises, rather than the school from which the child has to take some time out.
It depends. So if they're remaining on the role of the school, so if it's a mainstream school and then they are commissioning the alternative provision, then their school still remains the overall responsibility person. If it's us as a local authority who are commissioning because it's a full-time provision, then it's still the alternative provision's responsibility to look after their safeguarding, but we need to quality assure that. So we would do checks, we would make sure they're attending, we would make sure that all of the necessary things are in place, and we have a framework for that in order to do that. Does that clarify?
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Kaur?
Thank you, Chair. Just for the clarity of understanding, this will be a pool of vetted commissioned service providers which will help out with alternate provisions. Do you have any numbers in mind, or so the contracts, because it's a very flexible kind of a service that you need, so the contracts, do you think they'll be contracted to council accordingly, or how are you going to ensure, as you know, besides safeguarding and vetting, so it's easy for you to monitor? Thank you.
So any provider that is granted entry to the DPS will be on there for 7 years, unless we have issues with them being on there when we do our checks either annually or over the 3-year process. So they will be there for 7 years. Part of the process is that we will then enter into a service level agreement with them as to what we would expect. We don't then have contracts in most instances for huge sums of money. Usually we would have an individual contract for each individual child based on their need and the length of time that they need to be there. So then we would just continue to review that. In some instances we might have block contracts if we have a whole cohort of children, and that would be a slightly larger amount, but generally it's more individualised packages.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? No. Thank you very much. We bring this item to a close, and then we move on to agenda item 8, which is our major review scoping on absenteeism. So obviously we looked at quite a few topics. We had lots of briefing papers at our last meeting, which was really helpful to get an oversight of those service areas. However, I think that we kind of narrowed it down to absenteeism. So I guess, I don't know if you wanted to, Catherine, were you going to present anything at this point, or did you want to say any comments or words about it?
I think essentially what we've agreed in the report is pretty much the context is the same as what I presented in November, but we've just decided more of the terms of reference. So I think particularly focusing on persistent absenteeism, because that seemed of an interest to the group last time. So I think that's more what we're going to focus on, if that's acceptable.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments to begin with? Mr. Little?
Thank you, Chair. This is a subject that's received higher profile, even in the short time since we last discussed it. So I think we probably made the right decision in wanting to go down this line. My request is on the evidence and inquiry, if we could be given some sort of idea of what the council has provided historically and how that has changed and how it has been changed by COVID as part of this, so that we kind of know where we're coming from, because it's not a subject we've looked at in any depth before.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. Yeah, thank you. Councillor Sweeting.
Well, I think it's an excellent report, and I thank officers for putting this together. If I can look at the terms of reference and suggest a few sort of added words. One, to identify the prevalence and patterns. Now, we don't want to identify individual schools, I realise that, but could we do something about, for the primary sector anyway, it's going to be easier, on planning area. Maybe we could look at the prevalence of absenteeism by planning areas. And also, there's been problems with absenteeism before COVID. I know that I serve a ward that has got schools that have, for no fault of their own, have got particular issues with certain sections. So can we not just purely concentrate on why COVID has caused the problem? You know, let's look at some of the other issues as well. And of course, we need to have the voice of parents, children, as wide as possible. And so to understand and explore. Number 4, to understand and explore the nature of partnership working. So the partnership needs to be with parents, schools, young people, agencies of the council and external stakeholders. So we need to sort of widen it, I think. And sorry, can I go on? We could add an 8 to this, I think, to explore what other local authorities are doing. I know the government is very much involved in this, and there are absentee hubs springing up, and there's more that's been announced in London. So it would be good to know what other local authorities are doing, including our statistical neighbours. So I'm suggesting that. I think I'll stop there because I've gone on too long.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Smallwood. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Sweeting eloquently took my point around cohorts and ages and areas, and that I thought would be incredibly interesting to go into. Because it's in the paper, I am just going to ask the question because I think it would be really helpful to us to know what our top line base is on absenteeism, especially around persistent absenteeism. In the second image that's on page 5, there seems to be a dramatic drop from the one in page 4 of persistent absenteeism in the borough from 33.96% to 17.3%. Now, I don't want to tell you an answer now because I don't want to stray, but it would be handy to know, is that because there's so little data this year that it's just a bit skew-whiffed, or is it because we're seeing a massive decline because it's post-COVID or whatever, blah, blah, blah. I recognise that is what we are going to spend 6 or 7 sessions doing, but it would be handy to have, as that data is in the original document, to understand, are we working off 17.3 or are we working off 33.9, just as a base?
So it is lower, but that is because it's from a snapshot of just the autumn term. Yeah. So persistent absenteeism will grow over the year. I think when I checked it last week, we were already up to 19%. So since this has been produced, we have increased. So I'm not anticipating we'll necessarily get up to the same level that we did last year, because I think we are lower than we were this time last year. But that would probably, I acknowledge, be more useful probably to present, is the autumn term to the autumn term. But really the baseline is the end of the academic year. That's what we would normally baseline ourselves at. So it's more correct to take the 33.9% figure, and then I can just give you updates. Tell me if that helps.
Thank you. Councillor Hagar.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think it's going to be a really good, interesting piece of paperwork, actually, and I think we're going to be running with it as well, because I think there are going to be some changes. So I think around it, for me, definitely the external issues and risks and what's been happening, and actually maybe even looking to the future and forecasting actually what's going to happen in the future as well once we've gathered this. And also prevention. I'm always a bit on prevention. I'm hoping that from this piece of paperwork we can get some preventative medicine, sections in here really. So a bit of preventative work around the issues that come about, so we can actually stop it from happening before it happens. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Councillor Sweeting.
It would be good to know as well, page 54 provides information on what we're doing already, and it would be good to know how we are with all of that, and also the plans for the coming year. For example, one of those was develop attendance hubs in parts of the borough. So I don't know how far that's. I'm linking it to a previous item, of course, when a school had unfilled capacity. I'm not suggesting that particular school, but we have got schools with unfilled capacity that we could possibly be looking at that, and I don't know how far it's gone. So basically an update of where we are, what we're doing already, and the plans for the future as listed in that report.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Are we all agreed that we will confirm this as our review topic? Yes, okay. Thank you both very much. Are you staying or no? You're free to leave.
What arrangements are going to be made to secure witnesses?
I think we will just have to go away and look more into that now that we've actually chosen what we're doing, if that's okay.
Yeah, I would think so, Mr. Little. I think that we kind of need to take that offline and have a discussion. Well, we've got a rough plan of who we should be calling as potential witnesses, but then it's a case of contacting the schools, contacting the young people, the carers, and making sure that we've got those scheduled in. But obviously, if you have suggestions about potential witnesses, you can always email those suggestions to Ryan, and he can speak to officers and make arrangements, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So we've agreed this agenda item. We've agreed the review topic. That's great. Thank you so much. Okay. Moving on to agenda item 9. Then. Thank you both. That is the minutes for the corporate parenting panel. Do we agree the minutes? Agreed. Brilliant. Thank you. Agenda item 10. We move on to the forward plan. The thing that I would just draw your attention to is in February, what's coming to Cabinet is the Staying Close support for care experienced young people, and that was referenced in our corporate parenting panel meeting in November too. Mr. Little.
Normally at this time of year we have an opportunity to talk about the budget. Are we getting one this year or not?
That's coming to the next meeting. I think we just pull it back because otherwise we wouldn't have had anything for the next meeting, and we would have had 15 items for this one, so we just moved that one, and the Adult Learn annual review has moved to the next one as well.
Can I request in that case that we get the consultation document that refers to schools funding as part of the papers that we get for that meeting? There's a paper that goes to Schools Forum outlining how schools get to use up all the DSG over the year.
I will have to go away and look at that because I don't know.
Yeah, so sorry, I just said that without the microphone on. I just said, I don't know if that actually comes to our committee ordinarily, but Ryan's just confirmed that he'll go and he'll check and come back to you. Any other questions on the forward plan or any other comments? Sorry, Councillor Sweeting, yeah.
One of the items listed on page 3 is the school organisation plan. Now, that's been on our work programme for some time, and I don't know whether it's going to be possible for us to have sight of that before it goes to Cabinet, because that's quite an important document. I mean, well, I'll leave it at that. So, if possible, that could...
See, I believe that's coming to the Select Committee in March, and then it's going to go to Cabinet in April.
Thank you very much. I missed that.
Okay. Right, so then we move on to the work programme, agenda item 11. Councillor Smallwood.
Just to reiterate my point earlier about a witness session on the alternative plan, on the alternative provision. And then the other one was, I wondered whether we could do a witness session on higher education in the borough. Get Brunel in. I will have to declare an interest as a trustee, but the Union of Brunel, as a trustee of the organisation, but also the Union of Brunel students, which do amazing work. So I just wondered whether something on higher education, which we've never, I don't think the Select Committee really looked at, and there is other actually higher education providers in the borough where they've got some of the colleges and some of the universities do actually have there. And there's amazing work going on at Brunel at the moment with the opening of the medical college with the government's funding. You know, there's some exciting things going on there, and whether we could get Brunel in to hear about what they're doing, not just as an education, but also as good community partners as well.
Okay, thank you for that suggestion. Yeah, we can add that to a work programme. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Gill?
So just with the public consultation around the budget, I might be wrong, but I think we're the only Select Committee that meets after the deadline, which is on the, I think it's the 28th. So that means when we discuss the budget, any public that view the committee meeting might not have a chance to acknowledge that in their consultation.
So when we looked at moving the dates, I believe it was before the deadline, but I will just go and double check on that as well.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else on that? No? Okay, all right. So that brings our meeting to a close. And the next meeting, like we just said, is on 1st of Feb. So thank you very much for your contributions this evening. Have a safe journey home. Thank you.